It wasn't. All right, so here's an example property. This is a place I'm currently in contract on. And basically the high level details are purchase price 78.5. It's in Whitehall. It's 1,054 square feet. It has a 3-car detached garage, which was a big deal, which I'll get into in a second. 2-bedroom, 1 full bath. And overall, it was in decent condition. And I can actually jump over to, I could show you pictures, but let's just run through this. If you guys want to go into more detail, I can show you guys pictures. But basically, overall, it's in decent shape, but it definitely needs work. And so basically, we want to analyze it the same way as we look at any property when we're looking for a buyer and seller. Does it meet the specific criteria? So that's what I'm going to get into here in a second. So the first thing I want to do is see, remember, it's priced at 78.5. I want to see, hey, are the comps in the neighborhood in line with a property that needs a little bit of work? Is it in line with, with what they're listing it at? So as you guys probably know, if you've analyzed any properties over the last, 6 months in particular, definitely values have changed at the end of 2020 versus the beginning of 2020. So one thing I just want to point out here as we're looking and comparing prices, we definitely want to pay attention to the sold date, because if I were to go look, so this is 1,054 square feet. If I go look at places that were selling early in the year last year, I'm actually looking at purchase prices basically in like the high 90s, essentially. There was one place that had sold for 120 in May. But other than that, like if I would have been doing this comparable in May of last year, I probably would have said, this is not really that great of an opportunity. Then you see in June, you have another 123 listed at 120, a 125 listed at one and selling for 123 also. And then towards the end of last year, like that happened in so many affordable places, you see prices really jump up. And so now we start seeing 120, 125, 130, 134, or 132 coming into play here. And then remember, our current price is at 78.5. Now, one thing or a couple things that this agent did, who, by the way, she's been great to work with, but it was one thing that I think was a kind of a big mistake, is that she listed the property, but she didn't correctly, you know how when you put in a listing and it asks you to approve the location of it, she put the location of it is actually in Groveport. So that means anybody that had a map search set up for Whitehall and was looking for properties in Whitehall, they actually missed out on this listing because it was incorrectly mapped. Now it was correctly, the school district was correctly put in, but if somebody had a map search set up to avoid somebody making a mistake on other data entry, they may have missed this opportunity. So that could have kept demand down. But ultimately, she put it on the market on a Monday. I think she said all offers were due on Tuesday. We went and looked at it. And a couple things that I saw. So when I looked at all the comparables, the first thing that jumped out to me was that almost every other property in the neighborhood was a 3-bedroom, and we have a 2-bedroom. So whenever we're talking about renting a property, which is what we will likely do with this one, we want to, the more bedrooms, typically the better. So what I found though was that most of the properties that had 3 bedrooms, they're obviously the exact same square footage. So I said, like, where is this 3rd bedroom? Well, basically in the subject property, there's like a huge living room, dining room area. And in the places that have 3 bedrooms, they actually have a 2nd bedroom kind of on the one end of that area, and then a smaller living room. So the opportunity from an investment perspective was, for probably $1,000 or less, I can have my contractor build a wall and a closet in that area. That's a 3rd bedroom and all these others. And now I just probably upped my rent by $200 a month. So that's first opportunity. So whenever you're looking at an investment property, is there something I can do that's relatively inexpensive that's going to substantially increase the value of the property to me? And really going from 2 bedrooms to 3 bedrooms, even on the resale side of things, is huge, because so many people say my minimum is 3 bedrooms. So you as a real estate agent set up a search for them for 3 bedrooms. And even if it's a 2 bedroom, that's the same square footage, it's not going to come up because they had a minimum of 3. The other thing that I loved about this property is that it has a 3-car detached garage. And if you look here in the parking section of all the properties that sold in the neighborhood, the only properties that have a garage were the ones that were larger, except for 2. There was one here that had a 2-car garage that was the same size as ours. And then I think there was one other one. No, I don't actually. I think other than that, a couple people had carports, but no one else had even a 1-car garage. And then other than this one 2-car garage, no one, no matter the square footage, had a 2-car garage. And we have a huge 3-car garage. And so Whitehall tends to be a working class neighborhood where you have a lot of people who might be tradesmen or maybe mechanics, and might want to do something, some kind of business on the side out of their garage. And so from a value perspective to a rental, like if you go look in Whitehall, you're not going to find very many rental properties that have a 3-car garage. So if you're an auto mechanic and you work for Lexus during the day, but then you can actually do all your buddies' cars on the side and get 100% of that money if you had a 3-car garage, this is going to be a huge thing that would be of value to you. And then the last thing is, none of these properties have basements, which I actually like as a landlord, because basements are usually just problem creators. They usually don't bring you all that much unless you can finish them. But I love the fact that it's on a slab, but the 3-car garage also solves some storage concerns that some people might have. So I loved the fact that it was a 3-car garage. I loved the fact that I could do something to update it and create almost instantaneous value. And so I feel, and this was an owner occupant property, so the kitchen had been probably redone in the last 10 years. And it was just a mess. Like I had to buy it with all, it's an estate. And so like literally I'm buying the clothes that are left in there and all of that stuff. The family came through and, got everything that they wanted and left everything else. So basically, though, all of those things, I'm looking for opportunities to improve. So from a rehab perspective, and then I'm also looking at just these foundational things. What do I have that's a benefit that all the rest of the comps don't have? So it's just like pricing out a regular house. And so, like I said, for me, my goal was to find a property that needed fixed up that I could get instant equity in. And then my rule of thumb when I buy an investment property is I always want to be able to basically get all of my initial investment out plus the cost of repairs, and then be able to cash flow at least $300 a month. Like that's my end game. Every once in a while I'll veer from that. But I learned actually from Linda McKissick, from coming to watch her ever since I've been at KW since I was 22 years old. Coming to listen to her, she always talks about keeping it simple. Like you can sit down and do 100 different calculations, and you can almost always convince yourself that something's a good deal or a bad deal because numbers can be manipulated. But the reality is, if you have very simple criteria, it allows you to do 2 things. Number 1, it takes the emotion out of things. And number 2, it also allows you to make quick decisions. The more complicated you get with numbers, the slower you're going to be to make a decision, because first you have to go find all those things. And then next you have to then compare it to this and that and the other thing. And by the time you get done deciding, I already bought it, because can I get all my money back out of it? And do I make $300 a month? Yes, yes, done. Cash flow percentage. Well, my cash flow percentage is unlimited. It's actually infinity, because I'm taking out my entire initial investment. So, I mean, you could be talking about your cash flow percentage compared to what your mortgage payment is, or compared to what the value is. But at the end of the day, my goal is, like, for this property, I'm paying 80 for it. And then I expect it to cost around 25,000 to rehab. And so I just needed it to be worth enough to be able to refinance it and get my initial investment of 105,000 out of it, which I believe I'll be able to do, because I think once I get it fixed up and rented, I'll be able to get an appraisal of around 130 or 135. So it's very, very easy math. And then I'll get to it in a second here in terms of what the cash flow. So I just told you guys, I got ahead of myself there, but I expect that the value is going to be between 125 and 135 on the after repair value. I think honestly, with the 3-car garage, it's probably going to be closer to the top end range. And then when I'm looking at rent comparables, I think that 1,100 a month is conservative on this one, partly for all the things that I said before were reasons why I liked the property, but also this was kind of like what everyone else was getting at 1,100, meaning the rehabbed properties. I always leave the 5% vacancy rate in there. Again, with my calculations, I try to keep it really, really simple when I'm calculating things. But how do you find rental comparables? The MLS in the residential rental section is a great place to get a guideline. There's not a ton of rentals that go into the MLS every year, but there's enough to usually create a guideline. I will say you always want to look at active, closed, and canceled and expired, because a lot of times, for whatever reason, people mark them as canceled instead of closing them out. I don't know if they feel like because they didn't use another agent that they have to cancel them. But a lot of times I'll reach out to the agent and say like, hey, did you rent this? And they'd say, oh yeah, I rented it at whatever it was listed at. So it's just a way to be able to find. Zillow can be a good one. The biggest problem with Zillow and Craigslist is that they don't show past rentals. So you're basically just comparing to what's currently on the market, which sometimes isn't a lot, especially in the current environment. And then also, as crazy as it is for rent signs, there's still a lot of people, especially in older neighborhoods, that just put out for rent signs. So definitely drive around a couple neighborhoods in the area of your property and see if there's anybody listing for rents. And then there are a lot of popping up. These are relatively new to my knowledge. Maybe they've been around longer than I've known, but there's rent estimators. So the more, it's not estimator like I've spelled there, it's rent estimator, but Bigger Pockets has one. And then also there's several other sites that have them, and they're basically like aggregating the data from Zillow and all these other places, and coming up with like rent ranges based on different factors. So when we're looking at analyzing it, like I said, you're going to take your initial purchase expense. So this is a hold worksheet, and I can post this, or if you guys want to email me, or I can post it in the Facebook group for the office. But this is just a spreadsheet that already has all these calculations in there, but you can put in the list price, and then you can figure out fair market as is value. And you can set, like, say I never want to buy anything more than 90% of what it's worth, which is harder to do in this market. And then what you're going to put down, and then what your down payment is going to be. Then it's going to automatically calculate your amount financed, your interest rate you would plug in here, and then your cost of repairs. And so that's going to figure out what your monthly mortgage payment is based on all of those things, and then what you would pay annually. And then you've got your ongoing monthly expenses, which are going to be any property management fees, leasing costs. You can put in as much detail as you want, maintenance reserves, utilities. So most of the time, like in art, especially in a single family, the tenants are going to be responsible for all the utilities. But in some duplexes or quads, or as you get bigger, it becomes even more common. Each unit may not be metered separately for things like water and gas. And so sometimes those things, due to that reason, have to be included in the rent, and therefore become a cost to you. Now you can get those metered, but again, that's probably for another class, but it's something you can do. Michelle, I do my own property management currently. I actually just made an admin hire, and one of our goals is by the end of the year to transfer the majority of that work over to him. With these 2 properties that we, one we just closed on a couple weeks ago, and then the other one we close on this week, we're going to be up to 14 units. And so that's getting, we always said once we got over 10 that we would hire a property manager, but then when I do the math on what I have to pay a property manager, it's still something I'm not ready to quite pull the trigger on. Property managers typically charge on average anywhere between like 6 and 10% of the monthly rent, just depending on what other services they offer. And then they normally are going to charge you between a half and a full month's rent in order to get it rented for you. So it can take a pretty big chunk of your cash flow out. And so that's the biggest reason. And honestly, with 12 units, we probably get on average 1 to 2 phone calls per month. So managing your own property is not as much work as people make it out to be. And the biggest benefit as real estate agents that we have is that, and that's 1 to 2 calls per month is not per unit, it's total. One of the biggest advantages we have is that because we advise our clients already on handymen and painters and different things like that, most of us usually have those relationships already. So when there's a plumbing issue, we just call the plumber that we would refer to our client if they called us and say, hey, will you call my tenant and set up a time to go over and look at this plumbing issue or handyman issue or roofing issue or whatever that looks like. So basically this one, if you add these up, so you have your monthly mortgage payment, you have your property taxes, your insurance, this has no HOA, you look at your net operating income, and then you subtract your mortgage payment. We're looking at cash flowing after repairs, $582 per month on this one. So it definitely meets our threshold. And so this was a go. We paid, like I said, we're in contract for 80. We paid 80 cash, no inspection. And then I actually did $10,000 in earnest money because I thought it would just look good. I mean, I knew with no inspection and no appraisal, there's really no way you're getting out of the contract anyways. So it wasn't something that I was really concerned about. And I also didn't make it non-refundable. So if you know the earnest money rules, it's actually really difficult for the seller to get that money without taking you to court. And then I also gave up my commission on it. So those 2 things were the things that pushed it over the edge for us. The agent said they got another offer at 80, but they chose ours because of those 2 things. So those are some of I mean, that's from a negotiation perspective. That's where we came in. Oh, and that's the end of it. So what do you guys have questions on? I know I just went through a ton of information there. What do you guys have questions on?
I have a question, Troy. It's Michelle.
Yep.
So I noticed that on the listing, on the one that you're in contract on, it has no interior pictures, just the 2 exterior. Now, anytime, like my husband and I have looked for investment properties, And we found that anytime there's no pictures, that's like a red flag. And when you get there, it's really bad. So we've kind of given up on those. But I mean, would you say it's more of an opportunity, like because there's a lot of people who aren't going to do it, or is it a red flag when there's no pictures?
100%. For every reason why you don't go, you're less competition for me. And honestly, this one was an owner occupant. And it honestly was not in that bad a condition. Actually, the upstairs, it's a Cape Cod. The upstairs, this guy put in like all wood panel, like 12 by 12 wood panel. Like, think about mansions, the ceiling of a mansion library being like the dark cherry, like 12 by 12 panel, like raised panels. That's what he did over the whole ceiling of the upstairs of this, because that's where his bedroom was. And for those gentlemen out there, there's no bathroom upstairs, so he has a plumbed in urinal right there in the bedroom, which unfortunately, painfully, I'm probably going to take out because it's probably not all that great. But it was, I mean, he definitely took care of the place. And yeah, I mean, it was not, the lack of pictures, in my opinion, was probably just because it was a mess inside. It wasn't indicative of condition. And to your point, that was probably between the no pictures and the fact that it was mapped incorrectly, it probably cut down on our competition by 50%.
So do you go look at a lot of ones? Like, would you say there's like a percentage, like half the time you go and it's turns out well when there's no pictures or like?
Yeah, and I mean, I think too, just like with normal properties, like my question is, how hard is it to pick up the phone and ask the listing agent? Like, hey, and if you call them and they say, well, yeah, the reason why there's no pictures is because all the plumbing and electrical is ripped out. There's no kitchen sink, there's no bathtub, then you have to just decide how much work you're willing to do. But the reality is, I think there's always a price that makes something a good buy. Now, maybe you're just not into doing huge rehab projects, that's obviously another conversation. But I think there's always a price where something makes sense. In this market, the biggest thing I'm looking for is what can I have that will eliminate my competition. Now, that's not the only reason why I went and looked at this, but to your point, a lot of times the best opportunities are the ones that someone's done something that's going to limit the exposure. The other thing is, this one we went into contract on right at the beginning of January. And like the other one that we just closed on, we went into contract on the week before Christmas. And part of it is because I tend to slow down real estate sales wise over the holidays. But I will say almost all of my best properties that I've bought, I've gone into contract during like November and December, because everybody, including real estate investors, take off work. And so a lot less competition. So the other one that we bought in Wineland Park, where we own several, and we got it for $20,000 off of list price. And if anybody's looked at anything in Wineland Park lately, like it's hard to get anything for 20,000 over list price a lot of times. And so it was just the time of the year, and it was a wholesaler. And she came back to us 4 or 5 times and we're like, no, this is our number. And we're still probably honestly a little bit high on that one. But because we own so many properties down there, we decided to go ahead and do it. But it was a wholesaler, and she only ended up making like $8,000 on the deal, which is pretty risky when you're wholesaling. But we got her down because she got nervous when she had been on the market for 2 weeks. During the worst 2 weeks of the year to try to sell a property that needs work. Because honestly, go look at people's investors' Facebook pages. Almost all of them are on vacation with their families during Christmas, almost every single one of them. And so the chances of them pulling the trigger during that time are low. So if you're there to do it, there's some really good opportunities.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Troy, I got a quick question for you, 2 questions maybe rather. First of all, how do you determine a location when you're trying to find the most potential for equity? And when you find that location or that home, What are the main focal points that you spend the most time on for the most return, or how do you determine what things need done, I guess?
Yeah, well, the biggest, it's kind of like, well, it basically what I do is pull up the MLS. So let me see if I know I have these up here. So pull up the MLS and look at the comps. And so what I'm gonna do, I've got all those selected that are exactly like it. So I'm gonna look at the ones that sold for the most amount of money, and I'm gonna see what do they have in it, and that's what it's gonna take for me to get that value out of it, right? So if I go in and look at these photos, and this neighborhood, I use this because it's a really simple comparable because it's exactly the same square footage, but like approximately this is what it needs to look like inside in order to sell in the current market for 132. So when I'm walking through the house, I'm going to look at it and say, okay, what's it going to cost me to turn this house into this? And so for this one, for me, it's going to be probably about $25,000. And so then that's just what it's going to take.
And then as far as like determining the location, whether it be, Whitehall, I mean, would you recommend areas that are like, up and coming maybe, or lower, like the Franklinton Hilltop, or, areas like that? Like, how do you determine that, I guess?
Yeah, I think you have to go back to that initial question of what your goal is. So if your goal is buy and hold, then you're probably looking for an area that has already established itself to some degree, because in my opinion, buy and hold is a big risk in, like, for example, the Hilltop. Like right now it's appreciating ridiculously, but a lot of that is driven by the fact that there's no affordable housing. But sometime when inventory levels, kind of calm down and go back to some semblance of normal sometime, people are, not going to choose to live in the Hilltop if they have another option for a similar price.
Yeah.
And so I think you have to be careful. Now, when I'm looking at flips, though, somewhere like the Hilltop could be a very, very attractive area, because you can still find properties that are really cheap, and your goal isn't to have renters in there. Like, I know, because I have clients that own rentals in the Hilltop, that you're probably at a 50-50 chance of your place being completely trashed when you turn it over.
Yeah.
And so, like, as a rental property, I'm not going to buy a place there that has $300 a month in cash flow, because I might need all that money just to do the rehab if somebody only lives there for a year.
Sure.
And so all of those things definitely are going to come into play with regards to area. And I should have mentioned that. I mean, my target, I really don't like to rent, and this is just my personal opinion or my personal preference. I don't like to buy places that are going to rent for less than $1,000 a month. And it's all for those reasons. It's just because when somebody typically is paying under $1,000 a month in rent, they tend to not have a lot of discretionary income. And so the example I always like to use is, if your tire blows and it's going to cost you $250 to get it changed, and you didn't have that in your budget, then that $250 is either going to have to come out of rent, or you're not going to be able to make it to work. And so as the landlord, like when they call you and say, like, look, my tire blew on the side of the highway, like my two options are, I can try to take the bus to work, but I might get fired, or I'm going to have to be $250 short on rent this month. What's going to be your response? I mean, they have to have a job to pay the other $600.
Right.
So now, that being said, I also have a buddy that owns, 12 or 14 units that are all concentrated in South Linden and the Hilltop. And that's just factored into his risk tolerance when he's looking at value.
Awesome. Thanks, buddy.
Yep.
Troy, do you have a minimum reserve for each property that you keep in the bank?
So right now, I tend to be like pretty financially conservative. So right now, like when we bought all of our properties, this was really a retirement for us. And that's part of the reason why it's important to be as little cash in as possible. So we'd rather do the repairs and be, you know, as little of our own out of pocket long-term money. But we've pretty much taken everything that we've made and put it back into an account that pays for repairs and vacancies and all that stuff. Our goal is about 6 months per property of mortgage payments. Now, as you get more and more properties, it actually becomes unnecessary, in my opinion, because you have the leverage of multiple properties. But at the beginning, when you only have 1 or 2 properties, I think Murphy's Law applies immensely, meaning that if you have those reserves, you tend to not have problems. And when you don't have those reserves, you tend to have problems. And so I would just always recommend having 3 to 6 months for your first probably 3 properties, or literally taking every dollar that you make on it at the front end and putting those away. And then you could use, though, the caveat to that is you could also use like a line of credit on your personal residence that maybe you hold back like $10,000 on that you're not going to touch, as just like a rainy day, like, oh my gosh, if a roof needs to be replaced or a furnace needs to be replaced and you don't have the cash, you know that you can always access that money if you have to. Because I will tell you, like, one summer, I think we had to replace 3 air conditioners. Now all of our air conditioners are brand new, so we're not going to do that for 20 years, hopefully. But it was just one of those weird things. And because we had socked away all that money, though, it wasn't, you know, something that killed us.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Who else? Anybody else have questions?
Could you talk a little bit about your process, starting from the time where you decide you're interested in a property to the time that you're ready to make an offer? So, like, do you have an inspection done? What's your initial estimate of repair evaluation look like, and that type of thing?
Yeah, so we started off with properties that needed less repair. And then now, between working with investor clients, a lot of them, and then also, you know, buying all of our stuff and going through like a property that we took down to the studs, I have a pretty good gauge on what things are going to cost. And if not, I'll usually just make some phone calls. But I used to do inspections. Now I would say it's going to be really hard, like especially anything that hits the MLS, to get an inspection done. Maybe you could meet your contractor there and go through it, but it's just hard to get offers accepted with inspections, especially because it just takes away the cash value and if you're competing with other investors. So typically what I'm going to do is just walk through the property. I usually take a video, just so I can go reference it again when I'm sitting down and doing numbers later in case I, you know, forgot or whatever. And then I'm going to go and just basically write a list of all the things that need to be done and approximate prices. And I'm usually conservative just because nothing ever goes as expected. And there's always things that come up that you weren't expecting. And then if I have a question on something, I might run it by my contractor or whatever and say, hey, like approximately within a couple $1,000s, like what would this cost? And then really I'm doing that though in a matter of hours. So when I'm walking through, I'm looking for really obvious signs like of water damage or, cracks in the foundation. I'm, testing the furnace and all of that stuff, but also depending on how long it's going to be before, or how much work I'm going to do. Like if I'm going down to the studs, the cost to redo all the plumbing and electrical is significantly less if I've already taken down all the drywall, right? So those types of things that sound like, oh my gosh, the world would come to an end, actually isn't that big of a deal. And some of that came from experience. Like I bought a property once on a slab, and when I went to turn on the water, like literally I had a budget of like 8 or 10 grand. And then all of a sudden I went to turn on the water and there was water leaking from the meter. I fixed that. Then it was leaking out of the wall 3 feet over. And basically come to find out, this property, like every pipe in the whole place was broken. And so we ended up having to redo it. But through that experience, which was painful in the moment, I learned that plumbing actually isn't as scary as it seems, because it's really just, it's just pipes, and a little bit of drywall repair if you have to do it. And drywall is relatively inexpensive. So you start to learn that, like, again, it's finding the right people. Like if you call Jack Woods Plumbing to come replace all your plumbing, then yeah, it's going to cost you ridiculous arm and a leg. They're going to do a great job, but it's also going to kill your budget. But between Cream and our office, you can almost always find affordable people. And the more work you're going to do with them, the better pricing they're going to give you. And so then I just use that. You say purchase, you know, you look at what the after repair value needs to be, right? So in this case, it needs to be 130 so that I can refinance for between 100 and 105 and still have my 25% equity, so I can refinance and pull all that cash back out and be able to go on to the next property. And so then you take that number of 105 and subtract what your repairs are, and that gets you to 80. And so that's the max that you can pay. And if it doesn't work, if somebody else pays 83, that's okay, right? We just move on to the next one. So it's definitely, you know, remove the emotion from it that we're used to seeing with a typical owner occupant. And it's just, if you do the numbers and you put a little cushion in there, and you just have to stick to it, and you know, next time you'll get it, but this time it's just not going to work. So cool. All right, awesome. Well, I appreciate it, guys. I'm actually a little over and I have to call a client, so I've got to run, but I appreciate you guys jumping on. And like I said, I will be doing this. If you guys want to email me, my email is troyre@gmail.com. You can also call me, and I would be happy to answer any other questions or have offline conversation. And then I'm also going to go ahead and be doing other topics like this. So definitely let me know what you guys would want to hear.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll see you guys.
Thanks, buddy.